So let me get on with introducing the panel. We have Nkem Ndefo, who is the founder of Lumus Transforms and creator of the Resilience Toolkit, a model that promotes embodied self-awareness and self-regulation in an ecologically sensitive framework and social justice context. She brings an abundance of experience as a clinician, educator, researcher, and community strategist to innovative programs that address trauma and inequality, build resilience, and shape liberatory change for individuals and organizations through the US and internationally. And she's particularly interested in working alongside people that are most impacted by violence and marginalization. I would also now want to introduce Camille Sapara Barton, who is a social Imagineer who operates as a catalyst for social change, dedicated to creating networks of care and livable futures. They work as an artist, facilitator, consultant, and creator across the realms of embodied social justice, grief, pleasure, and drugs policy. Rooted in Black feminism, ecology, and harm reduction, Camille uses creativity alongside embodied practices to create cultural change in fields ranging from psychedelic-assisted therapy to arts education. In 2022, Camille launched the Gen Grief Toolkit, a collection of embodied grief rituals to support personal and community grief work, and my team will make sure that the link to that is in the chat. They're currently based in Amsterdam, and they've recently finished working as the Director of Ecologies of Transformation, which was a temporary master's program at the Sandberg Institute, researching how art making and embodiment can create social change. And finally, I'm delighted to introduce my new colleague, Stephanie Davis, who is the Health Justice Researcher at Healing Justice London. Stephanie is a scholar activist with expertise in critical and community psychology, a focus on the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and Black feminism, decolonial and queer theory and praxis, and a commitment to social transformation. Stephanie has held lectureships at Nottingham Trent University, University of Brighton, and the University of East London. She has previously worked in a community development and activist capacity on issues of sexual health, gender and sexual diversity, and police harassment with young people and Black and brown communities. In 2023, she co-founded Rainbow Noir, a social support and organising space for queer, trans and intersex people of colour in Manchester. And she's excited by the possibilities of the margins, the borderland, and the ancestral and spiritual connection. She's also the author of Queer and Trans People of Colour, Possibilities for Intersectional Richness. So before we dive into our conversation, I'm going to ask Nkem to lead us all on a practice.
Thank you so much, Rebekah, for the warm welcome. I'm very happy and honored to be here. And I'd like to invite folks into what I call a connecting practice. A connecting practice helps us connect better to ourselves. And when we are better connected to ourselves, we are more connectable to one another, to new ideas, to new possibilities. And so this is invitational. I'm just going to invite you right now to just notice how stress or relaxation might be living inside of you. How much space is taken up by stress? What is left for relaxation and spaciousness? Yeah. So just noticing that. And then I'm going to invite a practice and let's see what might shift. For this practice, I'm just going to invite you to start employing your senses, first by listening, just listening to the sounds in your immediate environment. And if one sense isn't available to you, no, we're going to run through several. So if you're able, listening to sounds in the environment and noticing what might be changing or shifting as you listen. And then to visually take in your environment, if this sense is available to you, by slowly moving your neck and your gaze to take in the colors, the shapes, the patterns in your immediate environment. And as you're doing that, very slowly moving the head and the neck, noticing Is stress ballooning inside of you? If it is, stop and do something more comfortable. Or is stress shrinking, taking up less space? Is relaxation expanding? And lastly, noticing tactile, the sense on your skin. Does your clothing feel tight or loose? What you're sitting on, is it firm or soft? Maybe places where your hands touch each other, or your feet are crossed, or your legs are crossed, just noticing the sensation on your skin. And at the same time, is there a shift or change in the degree of spaciousness inside of you? Do you notice yourself more present and connected to yourself, your environment, to my words, to this moment? Welcome again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nkem. That was lovely. I'm going to start by asking everyone to help me frame what we mean when we talk about trauma. In the prep for this, I mentioned that I felt like trauma was being overused, that we're hearing it a lot, but maybe without a definition. So I'd like to know, how do you define trauma? And in particular, how do you define racialized or oppression-based trauma? Nkem, can I start with you again?
Yes, I'm getting a little Zoom message. Okay. I mean, we had a little pre-conversation and we were, speaking about trauma being overused. I actually don't think it's being overused. I think maybe some things are being collapsed, but I don't think it's being overused. And I would like to share a definition that came from a work group. A good part of my life is based in the United States, in Los Angeles, which is a very large, a county is our municipal measure. And we have almost like 10.5 million people in this county. So very large. And we had a big process over a couple of years of big organizations, big sectors coming together to develop a trauma-informed approach to systems change, resilience-oriented approach to systems change. And we really struggled with what is a definition of trauma that is encompassing, right? Because if we use a very narrow definition of trauma, it is just an event that has happened to somebody. And this is what you would see from like a psychological perspective, a very conservative psychological perspective. And that this really limits our imagination, our really understanding of what trauma is and its impacts. And so I'm going to read this. That trauma refers to the effects of a single event, a series of events, and or ongoing circumstances experienced or perceived as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. Trauma affects individuals who've experienced the traumatic events or circumstances, their loved ones, their communities, immediately, over time, and over generations. It even impacts those first responders and service providers that support them. The adverse effects of trauma can be profound and long-lasting, resulting in diminished functioning and well-being, including mental, physical, social, emotional, and/or spiritual well-being. And the impact varies depending on an individual or group's resources, barriers, and ecology. And so this, to me, includes the trauma of the interlocking systems of oppression, of which racism is one. It includes not just what has happened in our lifetimes, but it includes the lineage of trauma and genocides. It includes the sense of the collective. When we watch racialized police violence happen, it doesn't just happen to the person, it happens to all of us. So I think, and it's not just what is really also important there, it's not just what you've experienced, it's what you perceive. That it is in no way can I tell anybody else what is traumatic. We must individually and collectively define for ourselves what trauma is. So in that way, if someone feels something's a trauma, who am I to say that it's not? I don't know what their history, their barriers are. How can I steal that from them if that's what they need to say? And we can also recognize that traumas happen on a spectrum, right? And that all things are not equal. But that does not invalidate the fact that somebody can still say, I have had a trauma and I understand trauma exists on a continuum. The severity. I said a lot. What do other people think? Yeah.
Stephanie, Camille, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you for that, Nkem. That definition was really, resonates a lot. The thing that comes to mind for me, I'm going to post it in the chat, is this episode of a podcast called The Emerald. This episode is called On Trauma and Vegetation Gods, and it's sort of talking about this idea that as entities, whether trees or human beings, we're kind of a living map of all the adaptations we've had to make, whether they are things that have allowed us to feel loved, feel connected or cared for, or things that have made us contract, feel small, be afraid, and our shape change as a result. And what this person in the podcast is arguing is that it can be very hard to separate those things from who we are. So I think sometimes because we live in the West, many countries that have quite Christian overtones, even if we're not Christian ourselves, I get quite interested in the way original sin ideas can kind of intersect with the way people talk about trauma at the moment, as if there's some pure version of us that exists without that. And in this frame, the idea that trauma is about getting rid of something so we can become pure again. And I don't personally agree with that. For me, I suppose I'm giving less of a definition now, but more of what healing could look like, or trauma recovery. But for me, it's about gaining more choice and becoming aware of the ways that the traumas I've experienced have limited my choices, and how that's changed the shape that I take in different situations. And healing really being about, or as you say, Nkem, repatterning, being about having more choice to move beyond the tendencies we can get stuck in when faced with certain situations, and actually having the spaciousness to move towards what's most adaptive, and not just be kind of unconsciously stuck repeating the same tendencies because of the ways we've been hurt and the environmental conditions that we are faced with. I think the only other thing I would say for now is I'm quite interested in the ways that our survival responses because of trauma intergenerationally, how these things can get kind of seen as culture. So certain things, for example, in African heritage communities, particularly those of us in lineages that have experienced enslavement, certain dynamics that to me and people like bell hooks, can be very much traced to those dynamics of domination, and yet they kind of get mistaken almost for culture. And I'm curious about what it would look like to be able to, feel more space and choice to move towards things that make us feel more alive, or that enable us to live more with our values, and to, again, have the space to discern what that looks like. That's what's coming up for me. I'll put the podcast in the chat.
And Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nkem and Camille, for those definitions and those thoughts. I think they're so helpful, and I think in our pre-conversation, I suppose I flagged that. I suppose some questions I have around how we use trauma, and I think Nkem, your definition really expands on that concept. I think the concern, like you raise, is more conservative psychological conceptions of trauma is this idea that trauma is like a one-off event in the past. And so I really like that definition, to keep a hold of what it's like, particularly for racially minoritized folks, to be living in systems that are continuing continued trauma, traumatizing us. So I think that's really helpful. And also thinking about lineages and the intergenerational impact of trauma. And I suppose other questions I have about the way we use trauma is how we hold the impacts of trauma, but also our individual agency, so that we're not over determining the impact of trauma, but also not underestimating the impact of trauma at the same time. So holding that nuance when we're working with that. And I suppose thinking about Camille, so what you were saying, it really resonates with me about this idea of purity. It's the kind of concerning idea of that we can get back to a pure sense of self before trauma happened. I think purity is like a very problematic, like Western, like Christian idea, that we want to steer clear of. And in my own experience, I found through healing through trauma, often, well, for me, I felt that it's meant that I've developed a more expansive emotional state where I feel more deeply, and it's changed me in ways that I treasure. There's some richness in the healing. Yeah.
Could I add something here? The short definition I like of trauma, sometimes you need, I think, a working definition, is too much, too fast, or too little for too long. Too much, too fast, or too little for too long. And what I like about that is that both of the definitions do it, but it's universal. There's a universalizing of we've all experienced trauma in one way or another, which I think destigmatizes it and allows us to start talking about it. And how can we, I think the bigger question here is, how can we talk about it without engaging in trauma Olympics?
Can you give a definition of that, Camille?
It's like, who has it worse, right? The comparison of, well, I've had it this long, or my people have had it this long, or we had it this way and you had it that way. Like, nobody wins, like literally nobody wins this one. And so how can we talk about with humanity and compassion and hold also the spectrum of severity without snatching away and invalidating people's experiences? Like, is this a zero-sum game? Like, my suffering is only real if yours isn't?
Thank you. And as well as the definition of trauma and being universal, I loved what you said, Stephanie, about beginning to heal from trauma had allowed you to have this expansive emotional state. And I wonder if you can use that to introduce us to talk a bit about your practice and your work and how you came to this work and your experiences of it, and particularly how you've seen it impact people.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rebecca. So yeah, my work has mostly been around working with queer and trans people of colour communities, like Rebecca said in the introduction, co-founding Rainbow Noir and other cutie pop spaces. And for me, and also particularly around my research with cutie pop group, about what it means to be in community together. And the work that I've done has really been around what does it mean to belong in community, and for folks who have experienced multiple forms of minoritization, often come with like multiple experiences of trauma and like ongoing trauma, and that the impact that has had on kind of disconnection from community, isolation, and what like non-belonging does. and particularly for queer and trans people of colour, a sense of fragmentation of identity, and for all racialised folks, that experience of being a problem. So working with those experiences and then looking at building community, and building places of home and belonging as a way to heal. And so in my work, in both my practice and my research, I'm really drawn to the importance of coming together in community, and the importance of feeling together in difference. So feeling that shared feeling of being a problem, but together, and particularly the importance of tapping into connection of the erotic and the erotics of being in community with each other. So that recognition that folks have when they're in community together, recognition can be very kind of subtle or more obvious, but of seeing one's lived experience in another person's lived experience, even if there are differences and as well as similarities. So really centering, bringing together folks with the shared lived experiences. And in my work with queer and trans people of colour, I think in building communities together, it is a way of stemming that disorientation and disconnection, while living under imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist heteropatriarchy. And my work has looked particularly in my research, I've been really interested in the joy and the erotics of being in community, and that the erotics being perhaps underutilized as a form of healing and building community. So when I'm talking about the erotic, I'm talking about Audre Lorde's the uses of the erotic. I'm just going to quote, so Audre Lorde described the erotic as functioning in, quote, providing the power which comes from sharing deeply any pursuit with another person, the sharing of joy, whether physical, emotional, psychic, or intellectual, forms a bridge between the sharers, which can be the basis for understanding much of what is not shared between them and lessens the threat of their difference. And in my work with QTPOC, there's this real sense that of seeing each other and being in community with each other, not just in movement work, but actually having a deep connection to each other, valuing that deep connection to each other is healing and liberatory. So that embodied connection with one another, and the QTPOC affirmation in QTPOC spaces has that erotic potential, and has a kind of empathetic and pleasurable quality, which is healing in itself. And I want to talk later a little bit about kind of the sort of uses of the erotic as a way to possibly address conflict in community, but I'll leave it there for now.
Right. Camille, I saw you nodding in recognition, particularly the idea around joy. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about your practice and how you came to it and the impact you've seen it have.
Sure. Yeah, I feel like my practice is a very shifting entity, but I could speak to some of the kind of broad strokes. So I sense that a lot of the work I've been doing in the last 10 years has been around trying to understand the societal dynamics that shape us through the body, and using that information as a starting point to assess how we can begin to practice culture change. So the ways that maybe our desires may not be aligning with what we're actually practicing, and how we can start to try and line up our intentions with our actions and what that's creating in the world. So a lot of the time, this has been mixing dance and kind of ritual forms of trance dance that are more connected to kind of Yoruba traditions, along with kind of embodied mindfulness practices, and in the last years, more and more kind of somatic frameworks. So for the last 3 years, it's been a lot of the resilience toolkit, having trained with Nkem and Lumos, but also other things that are now coming in from generative somatics. So there's an ongoing dynamic to it. But to give an example, in case this is a bit abstract, I've done quite a lot of trying to sense into how legacies of colonization actually impact our bodies and our social interactions with each other. So particularly trying to track the ways that we embody domination and using kind of embodied practice to notice those tendencies, and then having kind of free dance spaces and discussion-based groups to sort of notice if that's adaptive or not, and if that's in alignment with what we want to grow. And so kind of allowing interoception, like sensing into the body, alongside kind of these more, these conceptual things that sometimes can be very theoretical, like just discussing colonization as a historical thing, as opposed to really tracking how it shaped us and how it's woven into how we move with each other. So yeah, I'm very interested in practice and how we can, I guess, connect theory from not just being something we're talking about conceptually, but really living and embodying with each other and assessing if it's working or not. In terms of some of the practices that have been really key, yeah, I've mentioned already mindfulness. I grew up in a quite particular spiritual tradition that my parents are still within. And so there was a lot of breath practice happening and a very specific meditation approach that kind of introduced me to, yeah, certain ways of kind of going within, and in some ways kind of leaving the embodied experience. And then ritual dance has been more and more of a rooting practice for me, that feels like a way to connect to my Yoruba lineage. I know throughout the Afro-Caribbean diaspora, many of our communities have ancestral practices related to dance as a way to kind of receive ancestral wisdom and remove stagnation. So that's been a very big tool for me. More recently, Resilience Toolkit has been very informative and something that weaves into a lot of the things I'm doing these days. And also grief work is more and more of a thread for the last 6 years or so, very much inspired by the Dagara approach. So Malidoma and Sobonfu Some were Dagara elders that brought a lot of their approaches to grief work to the West. And that's really inspired, yeah, a lot of the way I'm researching and trying to create containers to tend to grief and almost build out the capacity to be with bigger sensations, given that a lot of things in our society try and numb us so that we're not really able to feel very much. So those are, yeah, some of the key threads that are instructive for me.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Nkem, we've mentioned the Resilience Toolkit, and so it would be lovely to hear more about the toolkit and where it came from and how it's been used.
I mean, I would say that that's one of my primary practices, but not my only practice by any stretch of the imagination. But I developed the Resilience Toolkit when I recognized that trauma was really a very root cause of suffering, internalized, relationally, between us, collectively, institutionally, culturally. It's universal. And I also simultaneously recognized that most people really were afraid to use the word trauma, period. Trauma is something that happens to somebody else. Because if we have to say we're living in trauma, it's like we're just going to collapse. We're going to stop. It's too much. It's too much to bear. And so I realized there needed to be something, a bridging practice, because there are some pretty great trauma healing modalities that exist, both in terms of like a somatic, psychological perspective, cultural approaches. There's lots of ways, but you first have to admit that it's a problem, and both individually and collectively. And when I developed this, I think now people are more able to say the word, but still it's at an arm's length. And so the Resilience Toolkit is a set of practices that are held in a framework to help us build the knowledge, the skills, the wisdom that prepares us for healing and liberation, whether that's individual or collective. And it's very practical, although we have like a lovely North Star, healing and liberation. How do we get there? And because I think sometimes when we acknowledge that, once we're able to say, "Ooh, this is going on," and we see the depth of what's needed, it can be paralyzing. What are the concrete steps I can take? And so it's a micro practice, a framework, and a way of engaging and understanding our own stress responses, our own trauma responses, and how to settle those that are not serving us, to reclaim energy that we can repurpose to healing work, that we can repurpose to liberation work, to again, individually and collectively. And so that's what I use, and how I came to it. In addition, I use other modalities, internal family systems. I use emotional transformation therapy that uses light and color. I am a big proponent of the natural world, plants, particularly plants, the elementals, as being a big part of my healing practice. So I think people often hear me or they've heard me talk, and so I'm sort of associated with the resilience toolkit. I do many other things, both with myself and with people, but that is what I saw the need for, the bridging. How do we get there to have the spaciousness, to even rehearse the freedoms when we're so locked up? We can't even imagine there's the constraint of trauma. It's like a shackle, not just on our ankles and on our hearts, on our minds, and on our vision. So how do we make some space there?
Can you expand on that a little bit about, I think Camille spoke about the making space as discernment, as giving choice. In the past, what does beginning to heal or beginning to have more choice actually look like for people when they're engaging and using some of these modalities?
I mean, I think a lot of times we're given a setup. The modality is good, and if it's not working for me, something must be wrong with me. I'm not using it correctly. And so one of the first discernments is to even ask, is this working for me? What does working mean? Right? What does healing look like? Often the ways that I know healing is starting to happen, when there's a lot of trauma, things are very polarized. They are literally black and white. They are a lot of binary. And I notice healing starts to happen when there's a softening and there's more nuance and complexity. There's a tolerance for nuance and complexity, and even maybe even a longing for it. I notice when curiosity and playfulness comes in, this is a sign of healing, right? I notice, and not curiosity to dominate things, and not playfulness in a way to distract, right? It's a real, like a very childlike quality. I notice healing is coming in when turbulence starts to settle and calmness feels attractive instead of boring. I notice that there's more healing coming in when there's more flexibility instead of rigidity, right? Which means the capacity to both accommodate as well as to repair, right? I see more healing come in when we're better aware of what serves us, and we're better able to hold boundaries, and not in the way of trying to control others, but in a way of what I will and won't tolerate for myself, right? Myself, self, and collective self. And there's not a re-experiencing, right? So trauma is something that's happened in the past. For healing, in that sense, when I tell the story, I'm not reliving it. I'm not having all the intensities. I can tell the story as a matter of fact, and it could be sad, it could have been terrifying, it could have been, but I am not re-experiencing it in the moment. And so healing refers to something in the past. You can't heal something if it's, in my opinion, you can't heal something that's ongoing. So I cannot heal the effects of racialized trauma because it's ongoing in a daily fashion.
I can work towards liberation from this and heal past incidents of it. But it is an ongoing process. And so this why for me, healing and liberation are inextricably intertwined. As I get freer, I can heal things because they move into the past. I don't know how other folks feel about that.
I find that really interesting because I feel like I've gone through different phases in relationship to, I guess, what I would tolerate in relation to kind of racialized behaviors that were related to me as a racialized person. But what I resonate with what you're saying, I suppose, is when try and get clear on how I want to say this. I suppose because I grew up in a very white dominated part of North London, I wasn't aware growing up of how much I was making myself palatable, making myself small, trying to be more, safe, stand out less from those around me. And so when that kind of realization came in my teens and also in moving to the United States in my early 20s, there were many years where I suppose the memory of that and noticing coming out of that shape meant there was a huge amount of distancing from many white people. And it took a long time to not carry that into every new situation I was in with someone, and to be able to kind of be in the present moment as much as possible, to understand this is a structural dynamic, but to, I suppose, allow there to be a sense of a possibility in each interaction instead of being completely taken over with the hurt of how that shaping impacted me for many years. But I noticed that it is a dance that continues to shift in moments such as 2020, when George Floyd was murdered. There was another wave of wanting to feel further back and wanting to pull back. So yeah, I suppose I'm resonating with what you're saying around this inability to heal from something that's ongoing. But I suppose in myself, I notice that depending on the moment, there is more or less spaciousness to treat every interaction as new when it comes to engaging with folks who've moved through the world as white or view themselves as white. So that's just what was coming up when you were saying that.
I just following on from that, there's something in my work in QT spaces. The UK is a strange place where there's very obvious processes of racialization at the same time as very silent processes of racialization, and when folks come together in community, like particularly in QT community, like people are able to begin to name their experience. This is a political experience of like sort of political consciousness raising, and like naming your lived experience as a racialized person. Folks begin to realize, oh, it's not a me problem, not internalizing it. It's not me problem. It's a political issue. And so in my work with QT, when folks come together, they're like able to be like relieved that actually, hang on, this is not about me. And in being together, people can walk into a space, experience whiteness, and clock it together and be like, that this is about whiteness. This isn't me. And that, I think, just that can be the start of a healing process, even if we can't completely heal from racial trauma as it's ongoing. But having the political language, which I think is taken away from us, or we often don't have the political language until later on in life, or until we meet other folks with that analysis. That's the start of a healing process.
Does anyone want to come back on that? Sorry, I see you.
No, understanding isn't healing. I'm going to say it again. Understanding isn't healing, because understanding is really a cognitive process. And trauma is experienced in the body and the mind, both. And so I think it is a piece of it, right? But I think, like, with the legacy of what psychology has dealt us is this sort of people get into, there's a claim, we need more mental health services, we need more mental health services. There's trauma, and people engage mental health services, which are mainly about talking about the issue. And and even if they get quite good understanding of it, they're still experiencing it. Right. And it is important, like you said, Stephanie, to have a name for it and know it's not a me, it's a political. I think this is hugely important. And I don't think we can confuse it with healing, because you're still experiencing it. Yeah. And so does it give you more space? Does it mitigate it in some kind of way? Yes, I think so. And what do we mean when we say healing? Like, what do we vision, right? Is that, this is why, like, I can't imagine it without liberation, like with it as an ongoing process. Like, it's not like I've had an assault in the past, and how do I heal from that assault? It's like a single event assault is a very different healing process than would happen when we're talking about these, and again, we're multiply marginalized, as you said, Stephanie, like, that's some tight constraints that press on us. I don't know. I mean, I think about this often. I get asked about it often. I wrestle with it because I know, having worked with and personally experienced the healing from single event trauma, or even multiple event trauma, but clearly rooted in the past. It just has such a different feeling. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, definitely. I think it's not just cognitive. I think there's something about what I was saying before about feeling together in difference in those kind of spaces where there's like a sort of transmission of embodied feeling between folks. And I think that real recognition of experience, I think there's something a little bit, can be a bit magical about being seen and experiencing that for the first time. And maybe it is the start of a potentially healing journey, but definitely it has to be embodied, like you say, definitely.
I like that, the magic, that there's a magic that happens in the communal knowing.
Yeah.
The communal knowing is something that, where do we hold communal knowing, as opposed to an individual knowing is quite often a cognitive process. There is a body knowing as well. A communal knowing seems to be held somewhere differently. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
As you were talking, that resonated with me, the idea of appeasement. So for me personally, some of the work that I've done with Nkem has been understanding my stress reactions, and particularly in relation to whiteness, understanding how I've appeased in many situations, whether that's been making myself small or the interactions that I've had with people, but being able to recognize that, but also to recognize it in a more objective sense rather than a self beating up sense, has been really important for me to figure out actually how I'm moving in the world, and whether that is and being kind to myself about those reactions being survival responses that were perhaps necessary then, but giving myself some more choice as to whether I wanted them to continue to be necessary or whether they would work in other circumstances. And I think that's really, really allowed me to be more open to experience, I think, rather than to automatically move away from them.
Something that's coming up for me is just around what's been said already from Nkem and between Stephanie around the connection between the cognitive understanding and languaging, as opposed to the body almost creating more trust or a different sense of something. And for me, I haven't found it that helpful when just processing things verbally and talking about the conditions and continuing to kind of be in that space around analyzing the state of things. Like, I think that's important to an extent, But what's been really helpful for me is being able to participate in like communal kind of grieving processes of actually being in the feeling together and supporting each other in an embodied level with that, so it can move, and that it feels like that pressure is kind of dissipating somehow, or composting. And equally with shifting my own noticings around being in white spaces, it's actually through living in the States and having some white folks over there for the first time really have my back in a very embodied way, and really standing up for me, intervening in situations that I haven't ever really experienced happening before with people in the UK, that kind of gave me a visceral knowing sense of like, oh, that is possible. That may not be available all the time with every white person, but oh, this is a possible dynamic. And that also has helped me have more discernment about who I can trust and on what level. And moving from that knowing, as opposed to just, okay, my mind knows theoretically that these people do this. There's more, okay, there are possibilities because I've sensed and experienced different ways of existing. And now I can start to notice what actions move in the direction of that, and almost have a sense of, yeah, who is safe enough, and how to actually consider that from a place of embodied experience, as opposed to just theory, which is sometimes what I've sensed in spaces where we are trying to work things out and understand, but it can stay in this theoretical space that I found sometimes to be quite deterministic. Like, oh, it's never going to change because this is how it is, as opposed to bringing in more practices and examples of like what those differences would be and how we could live them and model them and what could be possible if those things are being practiced more.
Nkem, Stephanie, do you want to come in on that? You look deep in thought.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it goes, maybe it's a little bit of a tangent, but it goes back to some of the stuff I was saying at the start about the importance of like the erotics of being together and feeling together, and that in our movement sometimes we can be focused on the struggle, and particularly in our current context, like under neoliberalism, we might begin to objectify ourselves and not connect with each other, just be focused on the movement and the struggle on the theory, and part of the work is about moving towards each other in movement, and it's relational, so the process is important as well as our like political outcomes. So yeah, just sitting with that.
Like the importance here of both the embodiment, the collective, it's the relational, self-relational, other relational, body relational. One of trauma's, I think, superpowers is the disconnection. How we disconnect from ourselves, from our dreams, from our emotions, from each other. And so this process of coming together, and I don't even, for some, ultimately it's coming back together, but for some of us, this is not just in our lifetime, but how many generations of disconnection. It really feels like it's new. So we're not going back to something, it's actually building something new. Though I believe connection is all of our birthrights, it's just not necessarily known. But this is sort of like the through line that I am hearing. It's like it's relational. It's and if I could use the one word more than somatics, more than embodied, is it's relational. And this is why I think sometimes people look at, oh, is there a practice you do? It's relational. Is it a process? It's relational. Is there an algorithm? No. It's the people, y'all. And it's so hard to be with people, right? When it's so hard for us to be with ourselves. And I think so many of us, especially as activists, do a thing where we focus out there. We focus on the outcome. We focus on the struggle, as you said. I think Stephanie said this focus on the struggle is because it's easier than stopping and feeling what's in here. So our capacity and ability to feel what's in here allows us to be with and reconnect and rebuild the relationality of the collective. Just because we're standing shoulder to shoulder, we're standing in the same room, our bodies are even touching, does not mean anybody's home, and it's truly a relational process.
Right. I think on that, I'm going to just suggest we take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back after the break on this idea of relational relations and how we build those. Let's take 10 minutes. So come back at 8 minutes past 8. And I'll remind everyone in the meantime to hydrate and take care of yourself, and also put any questions that are coming out of the conversation into the YouTube chat function, and we'll start to answer them after the break. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you were able to hydrate and take a bit of a break. Just before, we were talking around the relational element of healing and being together. And I know, Stephanie, you were keen to pick up on the idea of when we're seeing conflicts arise within activism spaces and within movements, and how this can sometimes be caused by trauma and caused by a sense of safety within those spaces, that you can act in that way sometimes because you know you're around people that have understand where it's coming from. Do you want to reflect a bit more on that?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say, Nkem, you were saying how hard it is to be with people, and it's really real. And I think in lots of activist spaces, particularly in like say QTPOC or Black women's spaces, there's an expectation that when you come together, it will be a utopia. Everyone understands where you're coming from and your experience. And yeah, that's not always the way. Actually, once we're there together, people coming with multiple experiences of minoritization and multiple experiences of trauma can lead to conflict. And that can be really difficult. But I think it's important to have that understanding when we're like working in those spaces. And I think also in activist spaces in particular, there's a real emphasis on critique and suspicion. And that's, you know, it's understandable for oppressed people to work with like critique and suspicion. You know, otherwise it might feel naive to not to do that. But how does that then impact our relationships if we come with that energy in relationship to each other? And that often means that in these spaces, folks might tear each other down, or that experience of trauma means that disconnection, that fear of others, and also fear of harm or fear of being harmed. And Fanon talked about how colonial violence is retained in the body, and part of liberation is redirecting that violence towards its origin. But I think there is something there about when it can't be discharged against the oppressor, sometimes we discharge it against each other. For example, we might not feel we're able to topple white supremacy in our lifetimes, but we can, you know, call out the problematic person in our group, or we can turn it on each other. And I think there's a concern about this continued focus on safety in our activist spaces. This kind of obsession with an external threat, or unveiling an external threat that needs to be removed. And this idea that maybe if we just remove all the unsafe or risky people out of our spaces will be safe, and at some point, you know, that will be secure. And it really ignores the ways in which we all perpetuate harm. And so, yeah, I'm interested in how we then move to more transformative modes of dealing with conflict, but with this kind of, I suppose, trauma-informed lens. And I wonder whether Nkem would like to talk particularly to that too.
I don't know. I think about, I often talk about the difference between fight energy and like visioning, connecting energy, and they're very different energies. And that what you spoke about, Stephanie, the critique, the dismantling of harmful structures and perspectives. We do actually need this energy to be able to do this. It's just, it generalizes, and we don't know how to move it into a different, the space. It's very different than the space we need for rehearsing freedoms, for dreaming, for visioning, for connecting, for the intimate and close. And that's possible in all of us, but we have to be aware of where you are first, and then to be able to discern which is useful and to what degree, and then have the skills in order to shift your system. And I actually don't particularly like using the idea of discharge, because it gives a mechanistic sense about our experience, that there's a certain quantity of X experience in us and we have to get it out. There's a certain quantity of grief and we have to get it out. A certain quantity of rage and we have to get it out. There's sort of this thing, and whether it's exactly true or not, what I find with that framing is that people have this idea of discharge and the amount, and it doesn't seem to translate in my experience of working with people over the years and groups. It doesn't translate into healing. It translates into cycles of building up and discharge, building up and discharge. A wise colleague of mine, Ray Johnson, said, emotion is not a volume. Emotion is not a volume. And so, in fact, and I'm sure Camille can speak to this, grief, right? It's not that we need to cry a certain amount of tears. It's that we need to be able to be present with the depth and enormity of the grief, and then it transmutes. So it doesn't leave in that same way, like a mechanistic view. It transmutes. It's an energetic change. And I think that's the same for many of our strong emotional states. It's the ability to sit with the witnessing, and then there's this shift. And it doesn't shift because we can't sit with the enormity of it. It overwhelms us. So we shut down, we check out, or we act out, or we get busy.
And Kim, there's a question that speaks to this. It says, I found that I mentally disassociate from racist experiences and other difficult stuff like grieving the loss of a loved one. How do I lean into the pain of it all while not spiraling out?
And a trauma is a trauma because it overwhelms us. It's bigger than us. It's bigger than our resources. So to even imagine that we could sit with it without any additional resources of some kind is just a wish for a reenactment. It will be a trauma again. It will overwhelm us again. So it's how do we build resources? And that resources may be a relational resource to have somebody with and accompany. It may be the resource of some time and spaciousness, not trying to do it all at once, to offer some pacing. It may be growing some specific skills of learning how to recognize when it is too much and how to regulate it down a little bit so that you can actually stay with it. Because sometimes people think it's like, only if I sit with it all at once and I'm overwhelmed, then it's truly like, this is saying how terrible it was and really gives it meaning. That if we do it in small bits, it's not diminishing. And it actually allows us to sit with the enormity just in small bits. I don't know. Camille probably has some more to say about, especially with grief. I'd love to hear
what you could offer.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very much just to build off what you're saying. And I think part of the issue is whether it's around trauma we've experienced or grief, even, in this moment of what's happening in Gaza. I've definitely had many moments of feeling totally numb, especially if I want to be functional. There is a numbing, I think, that can be taking place for many of us. And so what interests me about grief work, when held within a frame that's around kind of titrating, which is something Prasanna kind of introduced to me as a concept around grief work, titrating it in these small amounts kind of allows for us to be with it, with the capacity that we have in the moment, but coming back to it and really making that a practice, so we can almost build the capacity to touch into it and then allow ourselves to pull back again, because we don't currently have many spaces where we can be with these difficult emotions, not being given the tools to navigate it. And I think there is a need to almost build the muscle of being with these bigger sensations that are uncomfortable, so we can, allow what's generative about that to come through. So whether it's in the context of grief work, I think there is a lot about tending to it that can allow us to realize what we care about, what we love, and what deeply moves us. I think this activist, Malika David-Cyril, talks about grief not being the opposite of joy. Grief is the opposite of indifference. It's like it can show us what we care about. But unfortunately, when we have social media in this current context we're in, and there's so much vicarious trauma by looking at these horrific scenes, we're maybe the first generation to be witnessing a genocide on our screens in this way, right? It's too much. It's not possible to be with all of that. And yet there is this impulse for many right now to be just, this is the way I'm showing up, by looking through all of it and keeping watching and watching, but we're checked out. We're totally numb. So what does it look like to get clear on what's adaptive? Like, how do I want to show up for this moment and discern what's useful for me to be doing? But also, how do I make small enough and hopefully regular enough spaces to feel into what's there? Doesn't mean spending an hour necessarily being with it, but trying to deliberately sense in and touch in, and then moving out if it becomes overwhelming, but really cultivating that practice, because I don't personally feel our movements are going to be very sustainable if we're just running dissociated all the time. And from this place of like frantic reactivity, because we're not making space to actually feel what's there and be in relationship to that. And then to consider, okay, what do we care about? Where are the values? How do we get into alignment? And to continue to do that, because there's so much happening. So we have to continue revisiting that. So that's something I'm noticing in the moment. And I think with conflict as well, just weaving what you were speaking to before, Stephanie, in my experience from a lot of activist spaces, because that collective capacity to be with discomfort hasn't been cultivated, when something comes into the space, I think it's often met with that reactivity, because people aren't often able to hold it and hold the complexity. It's like, we need to find someone to blame. We need to push this somewhere else, because there's an inability to sit with it. And that's why I also feel there could be a huge benefit to engage with these practices that some activists might see as a bit fluffy, or something we'll do later when the revolution comes, but actually seem integral to be able to build that capacity for complexity and to be more responsive rather than reactive when inevitable conflict comes. I sometimes get the feeling that because there isn't that ability to sit with it, there's almost a desire to just project it. And I do think, unfortunately, when difficult things happen to us, it's not necessarily fair, but I think we do have to tend to the grief of that and the trauma of how that impacts us. Like, no one else can do that. I'm sure we can do it as a group in a collective way, but we do have to use our agency to work with that, so that we can keep our hearts open and stay connected to each other. And sometimes I feel like the moment we're in, there's been a desire to make someone else take the responsibility. And I think there's a difference between accountability and actually tending to the grief and the impacts that we feel through these systems, and to make sure that we can still stay in alignment with our values and keep ourselves open.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's an activist, Nim Ralph, always talks about we need to think about what we're doing in our movement spaces and what will be the impact in 10 years of how we're working together. And is that going to be is there going to be a positive impact, or what are the like maybe negative impacts of the ways that we're working? So yeah, building the capacity to hold and to work with conflict and harm is so needed. And I agree. I think some folks will be like, wait to the revolution, you know, we need to focus on the struggle, not what's happening relationally. And there's, yeah, that is all part of it. That's part of the work in rehearsing freedoms, right? And also, I'll just come back. Thank you for picking up the language, Nkem. I think I'm trying to think what I mean by discharge, and maybe that wasn't the right term, but there's something there about, I think what I'm trying to say is that sometimes in movement spaces, folks can respond to each other in the ways that they might respond, say, to a big institution, you know, and respond to a comrade in the same way. And there's not a recognition of the difference, and that ability to move between critique of the wider oppressive structures and then the critique in a relational sense, in a way that will build the movement, not kind of break down the movement. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I don't think they can do that. I think they do that. They absolutely, you know, generalize the response. I'm in complete agreement with you. And I do think the idea of the discharge is really common around people think they want to do trauma release, or they want to do, you know, or I'm so angry if I like just hit something, right? Like that will give me the relief. I wished it did. It's very fleeting, right? Mm-hmm. But can we sit with that anger, right? I do think there's important places where we need to mobilize, and there's also places where we need to just sit with the energy of it. And that discernment is so key. So key. And we lose nuance. Like, so if you're in a polarized position, right, where's the nuance? And it's a perfectionism I see that we have with each other, where no one's allowed to make a mistake, which is a real stripping of humanity. We all make mistakes. There's no room for repair. It becomes so absolutist. And so who's next on the chopping block? And so we're doing it to ourselves already, and then doing it to each other.
You already picked up on many of the questions in the chat. That's really noticing the moment, period of mass mobilization that we're seeing. Someone's mentioned that we felt like we had this around BLM a few years ago, but that it very quickly fizzles out. And how do we, if we recognize this need for ongoing connection, ongoing practice, how do we make it sustainable and do it at scale?
I don't think it's a very glamorous or sexy answer, but I think we have to practice. We actually just have to do the practice of it. So whether that's starting off in pods or even, you know, 2 to 3 people, like, we really want to make time for this, and you agree once a week or however many times a week, you're going to support each other to do that together. It takes time. I think it takes a lot of time. In the program I was running in Amsterdam, it was a 2-year course, and it took about 1.5 years, you know, inclusive of school holidays and stuff, 1.5 years of the group practicing the resilience toolkit regularly, for them to really notice how the shifts were impacting all areas of their life, like until they really were like, oh, wow, I see this. And, you know, I think there is a certain amount of agency that's necessary to prioritize the container and building out this space to then notice the fruits of that later. And it's not that it's necessarily going to take 1.5 years. It's kind of arbitrary, but just as an example, because I do think there's a desire in our societies generally in the West to have instant gratification and, you know, find the quick fix. And I don't think culture change works like that. actually. Not that I have the answers, but in noticing my own journey with it, a lot of these things have taken time, and I think do require a commitment to making the space to actually have these experimental containers and see the fruits that will take shape over time.
I think about, so in answer to yes, here, in this, the summer of racial reckoning, all of these major institutions said, oh, we must do our diversity and our equity and our inclusion work. And they hired people. And I'm going to say, there was a door that was open for a minute. And yes, there's been a U-turn. And yes, I think many of us spoiled the opportunity in that I think there was more goodwill at that moment. There was more of an opening to change. And we didn't take enough advantage to say, you don't change culture through legislation. You don't change culture through a change in policy. Do we need legislation? Yes. Do we need policy changes? Yes. But they don't change culture. Culture is relational, and it has to be an embodied process. And so when we have these major institutions changing their policies and these, DEI professionals getting in there and trying to make more space, right? That's the kind of thing that will slap back. Culture change is slow, as Camille said. And so, when people were in this state of urgency, let's do it. I know I was in a working with a particular system, and I got that pressure for the results. And I said, oh, did you want this done, or did you want this done well? Like, I just pushed back. I said, there's no way we can do this quickly. You want community involvement? There's no way we can do this quickly. This is slow, tedious work. And there's joy in it too. It's not all tedious, but and we've got to involve the body, and we've got to help people create, rebuild the relational, remend that relational field first with themselves, that reconnection, so that they can reconnect with one another. And it happened, right? It just took more time. And so I think about places where there were opportunities and we just went with the policy. So in terms of the U-turn, it's easy. Pendulum swings. When I was a young practitioner, I loved to, look at this miraculous change. I don't trust them. It's a pendulum. It swings and it'll swing back. It's the slow and steady that is enduring. And again, as Camille said, not sexy. It's not so sexy. A little boring.
Stephanie, do you want to come in on thinking about sustainability, but I'm thinking about some of the work that you've done on conflict transformation and trying to give the work longevity?
Yeah, I was just going to say there's a really great comment here about intense activism as an avoidance tool for personal difficulties. And I think there's definitely something there about reflecting on your motivations for doing this work. And I think, lots of us come to this because we're in pain and we want change for ourselves and our communities. And going back to the kind of conflict, I think sometimes it's easier to kind of kick off maybe an activist space rather than, talk about the stuff in your personal life that's going on, like confront folks that you're dealing with in your own life, or name things. So I think that's part of the work, is reflecting on that, and not to undermine the work that you're doing, but I think it is important to reflect on your motivations and how you show up. I think in terms of sustainability, I'm really interested in exploring transformative modes of addressing conflict. And in all my activist work, it's the constant question of how do we do either community accountability or transformative justice. And it's experiments in that, because we don't necessarily have the frameworks for the UK context. It's folks who are like trial and error, but I think it's that real honest, like real kind of commitment to building something better than our current punitive models, and resisting this desire to just remove the problem out of our communities, and actually understanding the problems that arise in our communities are part of the wider structure that need to be transformed from the root, and that it's something for all of us to attend to. And that's really hard work. It can be really hard work, but it's incredibly important. And I also think in terms of conflict, thinking about conflict as possibly generative, that actually when we're in conflict with folks, if we work through the conflict, it can enrich and deepen our connection with each other, even though it is hard work. But I really do believe that there's generative possibilities.
I just wanted to share a kind of experimental thing to maybe play with that, again, the Ecologies of Transformation group. We're doing a lot of conflict transformation work throughout the 2 years, mostly with a practitioner called Mara Maikes, who did a lot of play-based conflict transformation work in context in Colombia and other contexts of Latin America, but now is based in Spain, and so would come over every month and do sort of 2 or 3 days of intensive work with the group. And they had some pretty deep conflicts they had to work through during our time together. But something they started implementing that I thought was really great, because they started to play games for the first hour of every day. And they would like build up the kind of collective social nervous system amongst themselves, so that they could build the capacity to kind of, I guess, hold complexity more, knowing there's some stuff we need to deal with, but okay, we can still find ways to be playful and be in connection. And that created a lot more space for them to then get into it with each other, because it was almost like that those forms of relationality were just creating a little bit more spaciousness, because even I think this dynamic of being like, oh, conflict is hard. I agree with you, Stephanie. I think it can be generative, but the general mainstream view is it's hard. You have to take it seriously. And I think there's a way that you can show up and be present for it, but also bring in these things that allow it to be connective and to tend to some of the stress and the anxiety maybe, or activation that might be there because of our memories of how tending to conflict has gone. Because I think for many of us growing up without ancestral practices that have approaches that are really grounded in tradition and a way of doing things, I know I've had lots of really not so great experiences with trying to deal with it. So yeah, I'm curious about these experimental play-based interventions that can kind of set the scene to connect people in a way that allows it to kind of blow out a bit differently.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I just wanted to read one of the questions that's interesting that's come up on the chat. How might healing practices, or the preoccupation with healing destinations, be misused to turn away from the messiness of being alive or feed a performance of goodness? So this picks up on your point, Camille, essentially a device to perhaps purify us, as Camille mentioned, in a world which is deemed where our unruly emotions can be perceived as dangerous or barbaric. So what's the downsides of healing practices and the way that they're sometimes portrayed or pushed onto people?
I mean, I'll just start with just one place that just comes immediately to me is this idea that we should always be calm. That being regulated and settled is better than being activated. Which I find deeply problematic, because sometimes you need to be really angry and sometimes being activated is the best response. So I think that's one way that it's this value judgment about your vagus nerve, and you hear all of this, things that people should be doing. And the other place that comes is sort of this fix it mentality, that there's something how to be fixed and there's something to attain, as opposed to just an ongoing process and part of being human. The perfectionism of it, perfectionist fix it, something's always wrong, quality. Those would be my first thoughts about how they are dangerous. And to say, sometimes emotions are dangerous. I don't want to pretend that they're not, because they can overwhelm you. And so I think it's really clear about being what the difference is between an overwhelming emotion is traumatic for many people. And I don't think that's something to invite. I don't think it's something to be afraid of. It's something to respect and to know how to navigate with it. So it's not about taming them. It's about, do we want to reenact cycles of trauma just because emotions can be big and unruly, and just allow them to run willy-nilly? It's like fire, right? I really respect fire, right? I can cook with it. I also respect a firefight, a wildfire, as being, potentially quite dangerous. But the fire, at the gas stove where I'm cooking something isn't so dangerous as it is. And so just knowing emotions can be both things. That's my little bit there.
What was coming up for me is around just the individualism of healing in like the mainstream paradigm, in the sense that, that somehow if we just all do practices and regulate our nervous systems and, spend money on all the therapy, that's going to make us good enough to be worthy of this life, or give us the tools to actually create meaningful change. And there's something about that frame that bothers me, and I think ultimately makes business as usual continue. So I think one of the reasons I was so drawn to the resilience toolkit and working with you, Nkem, is this concept of alchemical resilience. And so really, using that extra capacity that we might gain from using embodied practices or somatics or whatever it may be, but then consciously noticing, okay, how is this giving me more space to tend to the collective, to share my gifts in service of that? And so I think that's a crucial element for me. But also, I guess the ways that pathology come into it is also troubling. And I know in many other cultures, for example, in Yoruba culture, we have the Orisha pantheon and these different kind of deities or entities representing different forces of nature, different kind of energetic states. So we don't have to, I guess, own all of the things that we experience as this is to do with me, or I'm pathologized this way. There are collective experiences that may manifest and move through us, but it's not necessarily about always us as an individual. And that's something I'm also, trying to kind of hold a little bit, to move away from just understanding emotional states and ways of being as an individualistic experience, and equally moving away from healing pathways being just about me, but more about, my role in the collective and what we can shift together. And I'm constantly trying to figure out ways to experiment and move more in that direction, because the mainstream wellness industry is not encouraging us to think collectively at the moment.
I just wanted to pick up on the question just before that I think is linked, about supporting people who are recovering from deep trauma, especially domestic and sexual violence. Feels like such a long and painful and often stagnated journey, especially for this type of violence where it's body-based, and yet people suffering aren't able to really engage with body-based healing and how to go about this and supporting this. And I don't quite have a clear answer, but I just really wanted to kind of echo what Nkem and Camille were saying, I think there's something there about folks often want to contain like deep distress, and particularly around sexual violence, folks can experience deep distress, and there's this like individualizing of their healing experience, or that it's their responsibility to heal alone, separate from the collective. And from my experience, as a survivor, I felt that a lot of like the pain of survivors is silenced, and there's not space in the world to hold deep distress and deep pain. And what I really felt like I needed was like a kind of a laying on of hands, to be with folks. And I just wanted to say that question was there, and I wondered if Nkem and Camille have anything around that too.
Yeah, I'm also a survivor, and I think the first access point for me actually was raves. As a teenager, I was having some pretty intense depression for many years, and being in a container where I could move my body without being productive and start to notice what moments of pleasure could feel like was the gateway that led to everything else. Because there wasn't very much that felt viscerally pleasurable to me. I was having a lot of dissociation. So I do think that pleasure can be a gateway that can lead towards being with sensation in ways that are manageable, and actually cultivating that agency of like, do I want this? Do I not? And starting to move towards or away from things. And plant medicine has also been a big part of that journey for me. I don't think it's a solution in and of itself. It's definitely been in tandem with lots of body-based repatterning. But I do think there's a real space for play and pleasure and joy in also being part of this as well. They definitely have been access points for me. And what else? I'm just looking at the question again. I think also ways to practice different ways of relating, because at least in my experience of how survivorhood was shaping me, there was a lot about having to sort of follow family expectations and fit into certain roles and reject or suppress the parts of me that actually wanted to rebel and do something else. And so being in spaces that weren't productive and getting to actually try on different ways of relating, actually caring for people in rave contexts and practicing harm reduction and noticing how different people cope with their pain and how I could interface with that in ways that felt supportive, taught me a lot about my own agency and around my own tendencies. And I think sometimes it's difficult to access these noticings when we're just in the same rhythm of productivity and work and education, and these spaces where we're having to be often very contained and not in tune with our bodily needs. So I'm not suggesting that the rave is the space. It's just as an example of something that did open up possibilities for me to also kind of weave in dance as a space to start connecting to these parts that were a bit numb or cut off and start being a conversation with them.
No, when I see that question, the thing that caught my eye was supporting people who are recovering from deep trauma. So you as the support person, in addition to what is being said, sometimes when we're supporting folks who are healing, we want things more than they want them. Sometimes we want them faster than people might want them for themselves. And there can be a lot of helplessness as we're being a support person for somebody who's healing, because we hear about their suffering and we feel very powerless. maybe even more powerless than they are, because they were at least in the situation and could potentially do something. We're just hearing about it. And so I want to extend like some care to folks who are in support roles, because this is about, how are we supporting each other? And it's to recognize that when we ourselves feel powerless in support of someone else, that can often activate in us fix-it energy, where we're trying to fix for somebody. We try to hurry them along. We suggest, right? Which actually in the end isn't all that helpful, because we're in some ways stealing their autonomy. And it's difficult to be in that support role when you are not in control of the pace or the direction of the healing, and how to really be with one another in that suffering that they may be experiencing without trying to guide it in some kind of way takes a lot of self-compassion, self-knowing what your own limits are, and a lot of self-care, or seeking care laterally, not from that person, so that you can be a support for the person that you're intending to support. So I just want to highlight that, if we're talking about belonging to each other, is being aware of when is our own discomfort with the hearing and the suffering of another person actually causing us to disconnect from our ability to be present and with them and trusting of their autonomy, as difficult as the pace may be.
Definitely. Did you want to come back on that?
No, I think that's really important. And Nkem, I think it goes to what there was a point in the chat about, what our own motivations are within activism, but also in connection with each other, trying to sit with how uncomfortable it can be to be with someone who's in pain or who's suffering, and what it means to witness folks and be alongside them. Thank you, Camille and Nkem.
As we come to the end of the time, I wanted us to end by thinking about, what does rehearsing freedom look like in practice? We've talked a lot about some of the dynamics that we want to avoid and some of our personal experiences of change. And I'm wondering if we have examples that we can share where people are practicing building coalitions, where practice is helping people to move beyond trauma and beyond conflict.
I mean, are we doing this right now?
Yeah.
Here?
Yes.
Are we doing it right now? Are we doing it here? Are we doing it perfectly imperfectly? No. I mean, I think the work of Healing Justice London is a big, to call folks in together, to put in structural supports, process supports, building containers, the holding to allow the magic to happen. I think this is a place where it's happening.
I definitely echo that. Yeah, I think I saw a lot of examples that were inspiring to me when I lived in the Bay Area in California. One of the things that sticks out to me was the way that the BLM movement around 2014, 15 was being supported by white activists. There's a group called Surge, Showing Up for Racial Justice. And they engaged in some tactics that I've not seen in England before. I don't want to say it's not happening, just I haven't witnessed it. I'm not aware of it if it is. What I found interesting is that the white activists in Surge were being supported in held containers that were accountable to other racial justice movement leaders, to kind of get into their bodies, to process the emotional dynamics of white supremacy and how they're related to them and how they move through the world, and really holding that work together in an ongoing practice-based way. But then for demos or things where support was needed from BLM, Surge folks would do all of that labor to facilitate for that for them. So that might mean booking a PA system, hiring a van, loading the van, unloading the PA, setting that up, doing all this kind of structural support work to facilitate the BLM activists doing what they needed to do. And I found this a really interesting model, and have been kind of surprised that there isn't more of this kind of happening, or I think it could be an example of some ways that, you know, enough trust can be built to figure out what are practical ways that folks can support so we can be moving towards certain things together. Another example maybe in this time currently is Jewish Voice for Peace. The movement work they're doing to say, as Jewish people, we are not going to allow the genocide our ancestors experienced to justify what's happening to Palestinian people. And they're organizing and mobilizing coalitions of people to call for a ceasefire and to really try and interrupt and hopefully end the siege that's taking place and end the occupation. And so I feel like I have a lot of inspiring examples from that context. And I'm hopeful that I can get better at going into the archives in England to look at what was happening here as well, particularly in the times where the National Front was more prevalent. And hearing stories from my mum, you know, there was a lot of people having each other's back at that time because the level of violence was very different day to day than what I grew up around in London. So I think that is stuff in the archive. It's just I need to get into that material. But I would also say looking towards the work of the Combahee River Collective and that kind of origin, one of the origin points of thinking about intersectional organizing and coalition building in the Black feminist tradition. For anyone who's interested, the book How We Get Free kind of has some amazing interviews with some of the members and some of the founding documents. But what I love about looking at their work is realizing that when they were building coalitions, it wasn't about all agreeing with each other. It was about having enough trust, enough of a shared North Star that we could move forward towards something with each other. And I hope that with the awareness and the language and the analysis that we've gone really deep into in movement over the last 5 to 10 years, that we can turn that towards systems instead of at each other and figure out what are the shared points we can use to move together, whether that's access to housing, access to a livable planet, you know, access to economic systems that allow us to thrive rather than have to survive. There's enough we can find that does intersect, that we can move together, but then it's around how do we have to hold the complexity and the discomfort of the difference in order to be in service of these bigger things that actually will benefit many of us. So I'm kind of curious about how we can go back to the archive to bring forward the principles that were in place behind coalition and move away from this idea that we have to think exactly the same, speak in exactly the same way, and define our language and our tactics in exactly the same way.
Thanks so much, Camille. That was a beautiful, beautiful way to say it. I'm going to end it there because I think we've said it all.